In February 2014, a flag came down in Crimea. In February 2022, tanks crossed a border. And for over a decade since, two nations that once called each other brothers have been locked in the bloodiest war Europe has seen since 1945. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine walked away with something it had never fully held before: its own borders, its own flag, and a population split between two worlds. In the West, a strong pull toward Europe. In the East and in Crimea, deep cultural and linguistic ties to Russia. For over a decade, Ukraine tried to balance both. That balance cracked in 2004, when disputed elections and allegations of fraud sent hundreds of thousands into the streets in the Orange Revolution. It was Ukraine's first loud declaration that its future would be decided by its own people, not dictated from Moscow. 9 years later, history repeated itself with far higher stakes. In November 2013, President Viktor Yanukovych abruptly abandoned a landmark agreement to strengthen ties with the European Union, turning toward Moscow instead. Students gathered in Kyiv's Maidan Square in protest. Within days, riot police cracked down. Within weeks, the demonstrations had grown into a full-blown uprising. By February 2014, the Maidan had turned deadly. Snipers opened fire on protesters. Over 100 people were killed in a matter of days. On February 22nd, Yanukovych fled to Russia. Ukraine had a new government, and Moscow viewed it as illegitimate. Within days of Yanukovych's fall, unmarked soldiers in green uniforms began appearing across Crimea, seizing airports, government buildings, and military bases. Moscow denied they were Russian troops. The world wasn't fooled. On March 16th, a hastily arranged referendum was held under military occupation. Russia announced a landslide vote to join the Russian Federation. The United Nations General Assembly declared the vote invalid. Almost no country in the world recognized it. But on the ground, Crimea was gone, annexed without a single major battle. The shockwave didn't stop at Crimea. Within weeks, Russian-backed separatists declared independent people's republics in Donetsk and Luhansk, in Ukraine's industrial east, the Donbas. Kyiv responded with what it called an anti-terrorist operation. It was, in truth, the opening chapter of a war that would run for the next 8 years. That summer, the war claimed a tragedy far beyond Ukraine's borders. On July 17, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was shot down over separatist-held territory, killing all 298 people on board. International investigators later concluded the missile system used belonged to a Russian military unit. Moscow denied responsibility. The Donbas War ground on. In September 2014, and again in February 2015, world leaders gathered in Minsk to broker peace. The Minsk Agreements promised a ceasefire, troop withdrawals, and a political settlement for the Donbas. On paper, the guns would fall silent. In reality, they barely paused. For the next 7 years, an estimated 14,000 people were killed along a static front line that barely moved. It became a war the outside world mostly stopped watching, until it exploded back onto every front page in the world. Through late 2021, Russia massed well over 100,000 troops along Ukraine's borders, insisting it had no plans to invade. On February 24, 2022, President Vladimir Putin announced what he called a special military operation. Within hours, missiles struck Kyiv, Kharkiv, and cities across Ukraine. Columns of armor rolled in from Russia, from Belarus, and from occupied Crimea. The plan appeared designed for a swift decapitation of Kyiv within days. It didn't happen. Ukrainian forces, backed by an outpouring of Western weapons and led by a president who chose to stay in his capital, held the line at the gates of Kyiv. By early April, Russian forces withdrew from the north entirely, regrouping to focus on the east and south. Kyiv had survived, but the war was only beginning. In the south, the port city of Mariupol became a symbol of the war's brutality, besieged for nearly 3 months before its last defenders, holed up in the Azovstal steelworks, surrendered in May. The city was left in ruins, but Ukraine struck back. In September 2022, a lightning counteroffensive in the Kharkiv region reclaimed thousands of square miles in days. In November, Russian forces withdrew from Kherson, the only regional capital they had captured, handing Ukraine its most symbolic victory of the war so far.
What followed was a war of attrition. The battle for Bakhmut alone stretched from mid-2022 into 2023, becoming one of the longest and bloodiest single battles of the conflict, fought street by street for a city eventually reduced to rubble. Ukraine's much-anticipated 2023 counteroffensive, aimed at cutting Russia's land bridge to Crimea, ran into some of the deepest fortified defensive lines seen in modern warfare. Gains were measured in yards, not miles. The front lines began to calcify. The war increasingly moved beyond the trenches. Ukraine turned to long-range drones, striking deep into Russian territory, hitting oil refineries, air bases, and the Black Sea Fleet itself, forcing Russian warships out of Crimean waters altogether. On the ground, Russia's superior numbers and artillery ground forward slowly. Avdiivka fell in early 2024. Pokrovsk and other Donbas towns came under mounting pressure through 2025. In a stunning reversal, Ukrainian forces crossed into Russia's Kursk region in August 2024, briefly holding Russian territory for the first time in the war, a bold gamble aimed at forcing Moscow to divert troops from the east. As of the summer of 2026,
the front line has barely moved in years, even as the fighting has not stopped for a single day. Russia continues to make small, grinding territorial gains, often just a handful of square miles a month, at an enormous cost in men and equipment. Ukraine's long-range strike campaign has taken a serious toll on Russia's economy, knocking out a significant share of the country's oil refining capacity and triggering fuel shortages far from the front line. Diplomatic efforts have come and gone in waves, proposed ceasefires, prisoner exchanges, peace frameworks floated by outside powers. None has yet held. Both sides continue to insist the war can still be won on the battlefield. What is not in dispute is the human cost. Casualties on both sides are estimated in the hundreds of thousands. Millions of Ukrainians have been displaced at home and abroad. An entire generation on both sides of the border has now grown up knowing nothing but war.
what began with a flag lowered in Crimea has become the defining conflict of a generation. A war over borders, identity, and the price nations are willing to pay to defend them. Whatever peace eventually comes, the decade behind it has already reshaped Europe for the decades ahead. This content is for educational and historical purposes only.
If you want history explained with the facts, the context, and the causes, not just the headlines, subscribe to War and Military History. Every conflict has a cause, every border has a cost, and every war leaves something behind.